I met was like, oh my gosh, you've got to tell your story and share like what God has done in your life and your story and how he's changed everything around. So I love that whenever I sit down with somebody, I always love to know like what brought you to the table. Like we all have a story that led us right here to today, right? There's all kinds of like twists and turns and heartbreaks and stuff that led us to today. And so I'm going to kind of give you the story of like what led me here today and like the vision of what I feel like God is, because it's not only just sharing my story, but there's something that Scott and I have talked a lot about that we really feel like God is moving, has a movement to move forward, right? So it's not just about sharing my story, but there's something that we feel like God is doing, and he's wanting to engage some people, and he's wanting to go, okay, like, is this something that God is trying to do in the world? So I'm going to tell you my story, how I got here. So I'm going to start out when I was just a little born child, because that's like where we all start. So, and I hope I'm not like mooning anybody. Okay. So like what we love about babies is like the innocence, right? You see a little baby and you're like, oh, the innocence. Like life hasn't gotten to them yet. They haven't made all these attachments about who they are or what we are. And there's just something about a little baby and a little kid that you're just like, they just give you life because they haven't bought into the story, right? And these illusions that we live out of. So like, I look at life and I'm like, okay, at one point I was this perfect, innocent little thing, and then life started happening. And I realized I started making up these stories about myself because like I had life circumstances that were happening that I made all these attachments to myself that's like, if somebody did this, this plus this meant this about me. Does that make sense? Like we all have those things like my mom did this, my dad did this, my teacher did this. So because they did this, this means this about me, right? So I started making up all these attachments to myself, and God really showed me in my story that I was like separating myself from myself. That I started like so then when something happens, we make up, well, this is about me, and our pain lives in here, and our story lives in here, like all these stories, like I think that I'm stupid, dumb, pathetic, unlovable, and then it becomes my belief system that I start living out of. So there's the pain that lives in us, so then shit happened in my life. And so I feel like God showed me this picture that's like I separated myself from myself. Does that make sense? That it's like I no longer could feel my pain, but I lived in this other story of like I was stupid, I was dumb, I was pathetic, I was never going to amount to anything, I was this. So I had this song singing all the time, which then that song made like a lot of like destruction in my life. So I was living like way out here from myself because I've got this story going on that I'm just making up about myself. And then, and because of that story, it was so negative. I married somebody that kind of agreed with that belief system. And it really worked for me because love was very dysfunctional and very toxic. And so, but for me, it was beautiful, like, because my self-love was toxic and unhealthy. So it worked for a while. And then in 1999, I really began this journey of, I was found myself struggling with an eating disorder, desperate for change. Actually, probably not 99, probably earlier than that. Probably like 1993. We'll go back to there. So 1993, I'm living out of all this dysfunction. I'm marrying somebody that, it's just, my mom and dad at their wedding day were like, we tried everything we could do to stop this, and you're still choosing it. Because I just kept choosing the destructive patterns because my song that I was singing was so pathetic. So in 99, I was struggling with an eating disorder, 93. I had struggled with an eating disorder since the time I was 15. I was in the hospital, my kidneys were shutting down, and the doctors had said, in a year, you might have a year to live. If you do not change your behavior and your habits, maybe a year you have to live. So the self-hatred that I had was so real that it's like me dying was probably for me a relief in the world, because the conversation and the story was so strong that it's like death really seemed like relief. Does that make any sense to anybody? Where you're just like, oh my gosh, this story is like killing me, literally. And I think so then with that story, I was physically killing myself with starvation, binging and purging, depression. So then it's just this dark cycle. So my whole life I just felt like I lived in this like dark cloud. And yet desperate for something more, because when I was younger, I always knew that God exists, but then kind of lost my way. My innocence kind of left, and I felt like God was like angry at me, and he was judgmental, and I made all these decisions that he hated me. So part of my story with God is I wanted to separate myself from God too, because God surely couldn't love me in all my patheticness and all the bad choices that I made. So there was just this separation spiritually, emotionally, physically from myself. So in 99 or 94, when the doctors were like, you're lucky if you'll make it a year. And God in his goodness, I got married. They said maybe you'd have kids in 4 years if you got your body back in shape, like if you were treating it well. And I think God in his goodness knew that I would never do it for myself, because there was so much self-hatred that it's like I never loved myself enough to take care of myself. And so I heard this voice that said, on Christmas, on the day you celebrate the birth of hope in the world, I'm going to give you a son. Like, you're going to have a baby, and he's going to be born on Christmas morning. And I thought, whatever. I had this thought, and it was like, came and went. Well, sure enough, about 2 months later, I found myself pregnant. My son was born 10 days late on Christmas morning. And it was like the beginning of God going, you have something to live for. You know, it was like when I found out about my son, it was the only 9 months in my life in a 10-year span that I actually took care of myself, because there was something greater in me to care about than myself. Because I loved my kid so much that it's like I didn't want to harm him and I didn't want to hurt him. But as soon as I gave birth, it's back in the same pattern, because the self-hatred just I couldn't stop destroying myself, if that makes any sense to anybody. And so every 9 months for the next 4 years, God kept giving me another kid. So, and they were like, they literally, I tell them all the time, I'm like, you literally are the lifesavers, because I would not be here if God didn't bring them to me, because I had so much self-hatred that they were the light in my life that was like, there's hope. Like, I tasted love the first time I looked at my kids, and I experienced what true love must look like. But I didn't have it for myself, but I found it outside of myself. And so when my youngest son was born in April of 99, I was back struggling again, and we won tickets to a concert in Muskegon through Joy 93.9. And we went to this concert, and they always talk about these moments where God just like shifts somebody's world, just like that. And I always thought, grew up Catholic, grew up that I was like this awful human being, and I'm this sinner, and like God's angry about everything I did, really. And so that was no hope. God wasn't really any hope, because it was like anything I did, I was damned to hell, you know. And but yet there was something inside me that there was more. And so went into this concert, walked in one person, like dark, the light world never seemed like there was sunshine. It always seemed like a rain cloud, because of my conversation and self-hatred, that this dark cloud always hung over me. And so I walk into this concert, and I sit in this chair, and this song started playing, and it was literally like the first time I felt like heaven fell on me. Like the love of God literally transcended something in me, and it was like I tasted something so beautiful and so great that it literally washed away so many conversations and so much, and it gave me hope. And I walked out of that concert, and I was like, the eating disorder was gone. Like it was almost like somebody turned the lights on outside. And I remember saying to people, like, did the sun get brighter? Like, what just happened? And I kept hearing like these verses in my head. I didn't know they were verses at the time, because growing up, we weren't really taught to like seek or read out of the Bible yourself. And I kept hearing these verses, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on you, because the Lord has anointed you to preach good news to the poor. And I said this to somebody, I keep hearing this thing. And they're like, well, that's Isaiah 61. So then I picked up the Bible for the first time, and I'm like reading this, and I'm like, oh my gosh, God is who he says he is. Like, he did for me what he said he's going to do. And so I felt like God was like, all I want you to do is give hope to people that I am exactly who I say I am. And I will do exactly what I said I will do, if you trust me. And so, and even if you don't, he still does. And that's a beautiful thing. But so we were like in this moment of God was doing all these crazy things, and I was like, oh my gosh, for the first time in my life, I felt like I had hope. Does that make sense? Where it's like, you have hope for everybody else. And I saw the greatness in everybody else. But for the first time, I'm like, oh my gosh, like maybe my existence in the world might have purpose. Because up until that point, I thought, oh my gosh, like what is the existence of my life other than to die? Because that would benefit everybody, you know, if I just didn't exist. And so God was doing all these things, and we were teaching these classes at Mars Hill, and I was watching people's lives change, because I'm just like, just believe them. Like, I didn't know anything else other than like God did for me what he said he was going to do. And so he was doing all these amazing things. And the more that God worked in my own life, the more, like in my marriage, what was founded on mess and dysfunction started falling apart. So in 2002, my husband had left. And so it was me and 4 kids. And I had been a stay-at-home mom, and so I had no way, I didn't know how I was going to feed my kids or where we were going to live or what we were going to do. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, and all I kept hearing God is going, do you trust me? Do you trust me? And I thought, oh my gosh, like, no, I don't. Because we always sing about, yeah, I trust God with all my heart, but in all reality, we don't. But God is teaching us to trust. And that's what I realized is God was teaching me to trust. And I didn't really trust, but he was bringing circumstances in my life to trust. So the husband leaves, and he's gone, and there was, the first day he had left, it was early in the morning, at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and we woke up that morning, and I kept hearing God going, look for the rainbow. In every situation you find, I want you to look for me, because I'm in there. Even in the mess, I want you to find me. And he kept saying, look for the rainbow, like the energy and the Spirit of God. And I think that's what, when the flood happened and God said, I'll never do that again, and I'll give you a rainbow, a symbol that you're not going to drown in your circumstances, that if you seek my energy and my Spirit, I will be found. And so he was like, look for me, look for me. And so that morning, we had gone into church. We just really felt like God was leading us to go into church super early that day. And my kids had gone into the youth, into their little rooms, and they'd never done this at Mars Hill where they face painted before, and they'd never done it after. But that morning they came out, and the sheriff's department came to church and interrupted Rob off the stage and told him that they had found my husband in the parking lot, and they were rushing him to the hospital across the street from our home. And so we're back in the church with elders, and they're praying, and they're like, oh my gosh, like, what are we going to do? And one of the elders is like, Rebecca, you do nothing. And it was the first time that somebody was like, you don't have to be responsible for somebody else's choices. Because for me, I always thought I had to fix everybody. You know, I have to show up, I got to do this, I got to love, I got to be kind. And the elder had said, you know what, we just feel like God's saying, stay home, be with your kids. And so I pick up the kids, and the elders were going to go up to church and be with him. And I get the kids out of the nursery, and all 4 of them have these humongous rainbows over their faces. And I just felt like God was like, I told you, look for the rainbow. You know, and it was like, look for me. I will always be there for you if you look for me. And it was the beginning of going, okay, like, okay, you're in this. I don't know, it's messy, but you're in this. And a couple days later, we're in our subdivision in Hudsonville, and we were standing at end of phase 1 of our subdivision. They were building phase 2 of the subdivision. So they had all their machinery bulldozing the streets down, and you know, all this equipment, and I'm just standing there with all my neighbors whose lives are all put together, so it looks like, because we all have our lipstick on and we look pretty at church, and we're all like, nothing's bothering us, but you know, my life is falling apart, but I look good. And you couldn't tell I don't have any food, or I don't know what I'm going to do without financial support or a husband, but I looked good. So I'm standing there and I'm like, oh my gosh, my whole world's falling apart, and nobody knew. You know, I'm just like, hey, how are you? Great, I'm super, you know, because that's what we do, right? We're just like, I'm super, and it's like inside I'm like, oh my God, like these bulldozers are like God is bulldozing down my life, and I don't know, and I'm looking at these bulldozers and I'm like, 2 years ago when you saved my life, I thought you were telling me to do something, like to give hope to people, and now you're tearing my whole life down. Like, now what? Like, I thought there was a plan, and I don't see a plan anymore. I don't know, you know, because my internal conversation still, while God set me free from stuff, he didn't set me free from the internal dialogue I had, the agreements I made with myself that, oh my gosh, you're never going to make it. Like, you're never, you know, so inside my head, I'm like, I'm never going to make it. Like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And so we're standing there, and I'm looking at these bulldozers, and I'm like, I don't know if we're ever going to make it. And all I kept hearing God go is, do you trust me? And I was like, okay. So for the next 2 years, we kind of go through, they're kind of bulldozing phase 2 out, and I go home, go to bed, wake up the next morning. I'm laying in bed that night, and I'm like, okay, so now we got to get serious, God. Like, there's no extras in life. There's no like Starbucks. There's no, you know, because it's now about bare essentials, because I don't know what's going to happen or how we're going to get home. And Starbucks is like a big thing for me. It's like a holiday vacation in a cup. It just makes you feel like all is well in the world, doesn't it? Like, I don't know why, but it does. You just hold that cup of coffee and you're just like, you know, the world could be falling apart, but I'm fine because I have this like warm cup of coffee. So, and I was like, oh my gosh, like no more coffee, no more whatever. So I'm laying in bed having this conversation with God. And so I'm like way out here outside myself, right? Like I feel like this is kind of, God is here, like in me. And I'm like, well, he's actually all around me, but he was showing me something that my faith is way out here. Because I made up all these stories that disconnected me from God. And God was really, I look at my story and God was trying to bring me back in. And so the day I was praying, I'm like, okay, no more coffee, no more whatever, like just bare necessities. I wake up the next morning and on our front porch is 3 cases of Starbucks coffee that says all you have needed, the Lord will provide it. So I was like, bonus, God loves coffee. And he was like, do you trust me with coffee, Rebecca? Like that was my level of faith and trust. Like I'd be willing to risk, like I'm going to give up coffee. And God was like, oh, you don't have to. Like, but I didn't trust him with the suffering of my soul because that's like personal, right? So I felt like God started out, will you just trust me with some coffee? And I was like, oh my gosh, like God cares about coffee. That's amazing. I didn't think God cared about me, if I'm honest, at that point in my life, that it's like God doesn't really care about me. He cares about everybody else but me. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's true. That's probably true for all of you at some level. So I was like, oh my gosh, he cares about coffee. So then for the next 2 years, God kept doing these crazy things. Like I kept doing these women's groups and giving hope to people. And along the line, like I had no idea how we were going to feed the kids or how we were going to eat. And God kept going. I'd go to church like with fumes in my car, thinking I just like that 1 hour at church was like everything to me. And I'd get to church and Rob would go, hey, open up to like Psalm something. And I'd open up my Bible and literally hundreds of dollars would fall out of it. Like I don't even know how that happened. So God was like, do you trust me with gas? Do you trust me? Like one time this couple came up to me and they're like, we don't know what's going on in your life, but on Wednesday we were at the gas station and I don't know why, but we bought you a gas card. So God was like, I care about your gas. So we're like, gas, that's awesome. It's like all these little things that God kept going, I'm doing. So then at this time, we got about $70 a week for groceries from my husband then. And that doesn't last you much when you have 4 little pumpkins. So I called him one day and I said, hey, we're running out of groceries. I really need money. Can you get it? And I'm begging him. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we're like, what are the kids going to eat? Like, what are we going to do? How am I going to do this? And he's like, Rebecca, I just don't have time for that. I don't have time for any of that. And so I start begging because that's what I was taught to do, beg. And so I'm begging him like, oh my gosh, I need this. And he was like, fine, meet me at Calvary Church in 30 minutes and I'll give you some money. So I pack up 4 little kids. My kids were between the ages of 5 and 2. So I pack them all up in the car from Hudsonville. That obviously takes 20 to 30 minutes to get there. So I'm driving like a frantic person going, oh my gosh, like he's my only hope, right? Like at some level I'm governing out of this, like man is my hope. Like he's my hope to get food. And so we pull up and he throws $50 in the car. And I get on the highway and I hear God go, how's that feel? You like that? You like that begging man for money? Like, please feed us. Like if you don't care about me, like I'm begging somebody who doesn't want to show up, to give me something that he doesn't want to give me. And that feels pathetic. Like you feel like, because we've all done it probably somewhere in our life where we've begged somebody to give us something that they don't want to give us. And it's like, then you feel like you're prostituting yourself or you're begging for something that's just, I'm not a beggar. And so I get in the car and I'm just like, God's like, how's that feel? And I'm like, terrible, it's disgusting. So he had me sit in that for a day, and the next morning we wake up and there's this knock on our door from this woman who went to our church at the time. I didn't know them very well, but they were like, hey, Rebecca, we don't know what's going on in your life or anything like that, but yesterday, all day long, I kept hearing, please bring the ward's milk. Like, bring the ward's milk, bring the ward's milk, bring the ward's milk. And she goes, all day long, I kept going, this is so stupid. Like, why would I bring somebody milk? Why would I bring somebody milk? And so she goes, I woke up this morning and I clearly heard I said milk. And she goes, it was so sure that God was saying, bring them milk, that she goes, I woke up and I told my husband and called our small church and I said, I got to bring somebody milk. And if somebody needs milk, they need way more than milk. And so she goes, we don't know what's going on, but you need way more than milk. And so they walk in with this house church of people with like 17 bags of groceries and this like laundry detergent and all this stuff, and they sit it up in our kitchen counter, and I'm like sobbing because God is like, you gonna beg man or wait for me? Like, it's a choice. Like, beg man for wait for me. So then God was like, will you trust me with groceries? And I was like, okay, I'll start trusting you with groceries because you just showed yourself faithful on groceries. So for the next like 2 years, God literally was like, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and our front porch would be filled with like toilet paper. I mean, things that I'd go to bed at night going, okay, I don't know. We don't have toilet paper. I would give God like my checklist. We don't have toilet paper. We don't have like this. We don't have this. And the next morning, like literally all of it would be there on the front porch. And he's like, I got you. I got you. And he's like, you trust me with toilet paper? I mean, that's like my level of faith was toilet paper. Like, you gonna bring me toilet paper? He was like, how far do you measure your faith? I'm like, toilet paper. Like, that's what we got going on. So like, he kept doing these crazy things that it was like, do you trust me here? Like, and it was like getting deeper. So then my husband was court ordered to pay like all of our bills. And one morning we wake up and there's like my minivan was attached to this truck. And I walk out and I'm like, hey, what's up? And they're like, well, we're repossessing your car. And I was like, oh, okay. Like, God had done enough with like literally like toilet paper, and probably $2,500 worth of money fell out of my Bible in the course of this time. So it's like, God was like, do you trust me? And I was like, when the van was like hooked to the thing, I felt like I was like, I got this. And I was like, so I called my friends. I'm like, well, the van's done. And they're like, oh my gosh. And I'm like, God's got it. I don't know how he's got it, but he's got it. So we go to church the next morning, and Rob ironically preaches about if you have a tunic, if you have 2 tunics, give it to your neighbor. Like, if you have more, give what you don't have. So I was mentoring and walking with this girl who knew I was going through a divorce, but she had no idea that we had no money. And we had, because you don't tell people those things and that you're poor. And like my kids, we have this thing in our house that I call it a love you bite, but they didn't know when they were growing up, the only thing I ate off their plate was the love you bite. Because it was about feeding them, and we didn't have enough for everybody. So it was like, I just wanted one bite, and it meant I love you, and it was enough for me. And so she knew that we were going through a divorce, but she had no idea the severity of it. And so her parents go to Mars Hill, and they had called, and they're like, Rebecca, we know you're going through a divorce. We know that this is all going on. We want to help lighten the load, and we know that like cars are expensive and all that, and insurance. So we have a minivan we don't use. And we were thinking like, you could have that, then you don't have to worry about a car payment. They had no idea it was repossessed 2 days before. And I was like, shut up. Like, who gives a minivan? So I was like, God's like, I got the van. Like, do you trust me to hear, Rebecca? And I was like, oh my gosh. Like, so the next day they come over with a car, and this little red minivan pulls up in the driveway, and my oldest son is like, the blood of Jesus just pulled up. Because at the time, my kids were like, all they knew was asking God for stuff. Like going to McDonald's, we would have to pray about it as a family because I'm like, I have no money. And so we would get together as kids and we're like, okay, if God wants us to go to McDonald's, then he's going to have to provide the way. And sure enough, like within 2 days, there would be gift cards. And again, nobody knew what we were praying about. Gift cards in the mailbox to McDonald's. And we were like, God cares about McDonald's. And like all these crazy things are happening. And my son has a peanut allergy, and he needed an EpiPen. We had gone to the doctors, and the doctors are like, he needs an EpiPen. And he had had a peanut allergy since he was 1. And so he was now 6, and they're like, he needs a peanut allergy, this thing. So we went to Target, and they told me it was going to be $150 for this EpiPen. And I was like, we don't have $150. So again, I didn't tell anybody because judgment. That is like, if I tell somebody I'm not going to get this EpiPen, I'm going to be a terrible mom because I'm not even taking care of my kids. So I didn't say anything. I thought, I'm just going to like not get the EpiPen. I had this conversation with God. I was like, listen, you've taken care of him for the last 5 years that we've known about this. You're going to have to take care of him now because I can't afford the EpiPen. The next day, an EpiPen shows up in our mailbox, and God was like, I'm just going to give it to you because you know you don't need it. So we have this EpiPen. It's still on the bookshelf in my office downstairs because God's like, you didn't need it because you trusted me. Like, he's like, you knew I got it, and I just gave it to you just to show you I could do it. Does that make sense? It was like, shut up. Every time this stuff happened, I was like, shut up. So I kept getting bigger and bigger, and then the closer we got to the divorce and having everything final, I was like, oh my gosh, like, where are we going to go? Like, I have no job. I've got no money. I've got no way to support my kids. How am I going to feed them? Like, what? And all the time, God's just like, do you trust me? And I was like, I'm really trying hard to. So we get to this place at this house, and our house is going for sale because we tried to stay in it. My ex-husband was like, when hell freezes over, she'll stay in the house. And God was just like, I got this. And so there was this moment, I like to call it my Gideon moment with God, where I said, okay, I'm not trusting you. I need to know you can do impossible things. Not people who listen to my story and go, you still struggle with trusting God? Because he's shown up for you for the last 17 years. Alicia said that. She's like, how do you still struggle with trust? And so I had this moment with God, with the house sells, and we're going to have to be out in like 30 days. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like I have no idea what we're going to do. So I had this Gideon moment with God. I'm like, okay, I need you to show me. Like this wasn't enough. 2 years of like unbelievable financial provision, stuff showing up in my trunk. Like I'd lay in bed and God's like, go clean your car. And my car would be full of groceries and food, and it's like crazy stuff. And so God was like, I'm like, okay, I need to know that you're calling me to trust with this house, because everyone kept telling me, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And I'm like, I'm going to trust God. And people are like, what? Like some people were like, you can't live on faith and miracles, Rebecca. Like you can't think that God's just going to show up. Like that'd be crazy, and you can't keep living that way. But there was this call that I felt like God was like, be still and know that I'm God. So I tell God, one night, I'm like, okay, I need you to do something that I know is impossible for man. Because all these things you can go, okay, God, like, man kind of had something to do with it because they brought it to the house somehow. And I was like, I just need to know if this is you, show me an impossible thing. So we had friends, mutual friends of ours that had tried for 7 years to have a baby. And I was like, listen, if you give them a baby, I'll believe you with this house deal. And so I called friends of ours, and I called up my friends Russ and Julie, and I said, hey, I really need you to have a baby because God's telling me he's got a plan for where we're going to go and where we're going to live, and I need him to show me an impossible thing. And so will you fast and pray with me that God gives you a kid? And they're like, well, yeah. So we fast and prayed, and during that time, the house goes on the market, and about 38 days later, 40 days later, I'm in the house, and I hear a knock on the door, and I hear Julie in my house going, Rebecca. And I come out, and I'm like, what are you doing here? She lives way on the other side of town. And she's like, I came over to show you something. And I was like, what? And she holds out her hand, and it's a pregnancy test that shows that she's positive. And I fell on my knees, and I'm crying, and I'm like, do you know how bad I needed you to be pregnant? Like, it was like God going, I got this. Like, I got it, Rebecca. Like, I got it. And so then they gave babies, and I was like, what? So their first kid, literally to me is like a divine representation that God can do impossible things. So now they have 3 little girls, and her husband's always like, you can stop praying now. We're good. So I was like, okay, you did the impossible. I'm going to trust you. This makes no sense. And it was like labor of faith. Like those of us that have had children, it was like faith is like this unbelievable pressure, and this like I felt like I was dilated at 10, and like if I don't know what's going to come out, monster, or like what's going to come out of this labor of faith. And so God's like, I said, trust me. So we were at church at Mars Hill one night, and I heard God say, show them what I told you. So going back to that first week where we were in the subdivision with our friends, and they were saying in the cookout, and phase 2 was being done. Well, every day for the next year, the kids and I would walk through phase 2, and we would just pray, just going, I don't know where you're leading us. It was kind of like this visual, like I'm paving a path, you can't see it yet. You can't see the bigger picture. So every day we would just pray, walking through phase 2 of this subdivision. And God was like, every time we turned the corner of the street, this house that was being built was like, as soon as I saw it, God was like, you're going to live there. And it was like this brand new home being built, and it was like, you're going to live there. It got to the point where the kids and I walked through the house, and they were painting it, and I was like the color, good color scheme, God. I had no money, and I had no like way to get it. But yeah, I felt like God was like, you're going to live here someday. And so we were leaving church, and something inside me was like, tell somebody the story. because God always puts a witness to something, so it's like somebody can testify that's like what she's saying is true. So I had a friend with me in the car, and I said, hey, can I show you something? And he was like, yeah. So we pull up to this house, and I said, I feel like God is saying, this house is immeasurably more than I could ever hope or imagine, and I feel like God's saying, I'm going to live here one day. And he was like, Rebecca, like, no, it's not going to. He tapped my leg and was like, you can't afford that house. There's no way it's ever going to happen. And I said, my hope isn't in the house. My hope is in that God is big enough to do the house. Like, I don't know how it's going to play out. And even if it's not this house, it's going to be something mind-blowing as big as this house. I don't know what it is, but God is saying, I'm going to do this house. So, and he was just like, okay. So he drops me off, and the house sells. We have 30 days to get out. I'm packing up boxes. Everyone in my life is like, where are you going to go and what are you going to do? And I'm like, I have no idea. No idea. And God was like, where are you going to go? No idea. And all I kept hearing is, be still and know that I'm God. Be still and know that I'm God. And it was labor, like labor. And so I was laying in bed one night, and I heard God say, I left off on this Bible study, and I was laying in bed, and I was desperate because I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I would prostitute myself for my kids. I would, as a mom, you would do anything to put food on the table. And I'm like, I didn't know how I was going to put food on the table. I'm like, oh my gosh, the things I would do if I didn't feel like you were calling me to trust and to be still, and what my anxiousness and anxiety and fear would have chosen if I didn't have a relationship with you. And so I'm laying there just going, oh my gosh, like all the things that I would have done or could have done if God wasn't saying, be right here. So I was laying in bed, and I'm like, what do you want me to do? Like, there's got to be something you want me to do. Everyone's saying, do something, do something. And God's like, I said, seek me like you've never sought me before. And I'm like, you are like the beginning and the end of all things. So I get up, and in my Bible study, I left off in the middle of this page, and I opened it up. And then in the next line on the page was, look up Psalm 46:10. And it says, be still and know that I'm God. And the very next sentence in the Bethmore Bible study said, being still is so much harder than doing. And I was like, oh my gosh, you have no idea. Like, she had no idea. I was like dilated to 10, God going, like bearing down, going, do you trust me? And I'm like, oh my gosh, being still is hard when God is calling you to trust. So I was like, okay, that was just another sign that God's like, I'm right here in this with you.